So I would like to welcome Dr. Noakes and thank him for talking to us today. It's an honor and privilege to have you here with us and to be speaking to you. Just a quick introduction of Dr. Noakes, because he's a celebrity, very famous in South Africa. But for those that do not know him, here's just a brief synopsis. So Dr. Noakes got his medical degree in 1981 and also his doctorate of science in exercise science in 2002. He's one of the founding members of the Sports Science Institute of South Africa. He has published more than 750 scientific books and articles. He has been cited more than 16,000 times in the scientific literature. He's won numerous awards over the years and has been also on editorial boards. He's written a couple of books, Law of Running, considered the kind of Bible of sport and running. His autobiography, Challenging Beliefs, Waterlogged, the serious problem of overhydration in endurance sports, the real meal revolution, raising superheroes. He's been physically active all his life, and he's run more than 70 marathons and ultra marathons. Also, just because Dr. Noakes is so well published in the field, and we'll be going through some of these topics as we go through this interview, but he has looked at are marathon runners immune to heart disease? He has looked at hydration or dehydration, overhydration in sports. Do carbohydrates give you energy? What regulates exercise performance? Fatigue, rugby and overtraining, and then more recently, low-fat diets, high-fat diets, and which are healthy. And as we go through, hopefully we can cover some of those topics. So first off, I wanted to start off with some more recent developments in your life, because since last time we spoke, there was something big that happened. So if you don't mind, could you just give us a summary of this whole Twitter trial that you've been going through? Where did it get started? What happened, and what was the outcome and implications of that?
Indeed, Philip. So I started changing my life and changing my diet in 2010 and wrote the book, The Real Meal Revolution. And that really changed a lot of people's ideas about diet in South Africa. And we estimate a couple of million people have gone from eating a high carbohydrate diet to going to eating a high fat diet and taking control of their health. And I think that a lot of people weren't happy with that. A lot of medical colleagues, and particularly dietitians, didn't think very much of this idea because people were taking responsibility for their own health and they were making themselves healthy through nutrition rather than through pharmacological drugs and so on. So fast forward, there was a move to try to shut me up. And it begins with a tweet that I gave, and a dietitian in Johannesburg, South Africa, decided that what I was tweeting about was dangerous, and she reported me to the Health Professional Council of South Africa. And all my tweet said, in essence, was that it suggested that if you weaned your child, you should wean them onto real foods, i.e. low carbohydrate, high fat foods, as humans have been doing for millions of years, and in fact, as are the South African dietary guidelines. But because she hadn't perhaps read the dietary guidelines, I got reported, and then it became very clear that the governing body that I'm answerable to as a medical doctor, the Health Professional Council, were clearly targeting me because instead of sending the complaint to a pediatrician with an interest in nutrition, who would have said what Dr. Noakes is saying is fine, it's absolutely correct, there's no problem, they sent it to the person who drew up the South African dietary guidelines, which doesn't make sense. And of course, the person who drew up the South African dietary guidelines doesn't believe that we should be eating a high-fat diet. She believes we should be eating maize and grains, as is the traditional dietary guidelines. So of course, she attacked me and said that my advice was dangerous. But she attacked me on the advice for adults rather than for children. So anyway, the Health Professional Council made a couple of other errors and eventually decided to charge me. So we had a case that went on for 25 days in court. 25 days, can you imagine it, over a tweet of 7 words? I mean, it was completely ridiculous. It cost millions of rands to both myself and to the Health Professional Council. I brought out 3 world authority experts, including Nina Teichelt from New York, and she was just spectacular. And at the end of 25 days, the ruling was that on 10 counts, I was correct, and on 0 counts, I was wrong. So I won 10-0. And so I was declared not guilty of any misconduct according to my conduct as a medical doctor. So that happened on April the 21st. So we're really happy about that. It's kind of taken this weight off my shoulders, which have been there for 3 years. Yeah, and they're threatening to appeal the case, which just shows how ridiculous it is, because there is nothing to appeal. There never was a case, and so it may go forward further, but that's fine. I think what it did give us the opportunity is to write a book about the whole thing. So by the end of the year, myself and a investigative journalist have written a book, and it's called Nutrition on Trial: Challenging Current Dietary Advice. And it's fantastic because it just destroys the arguments that they presented. And it also goes and looks at all the stuff that's been said about me over the last 5 years about nutrition. And I've been able to say, listen, here's the evidence. This is what you said. This is the evidence. Judge for yourselves. So it's been exciting. It's been very tough emotionally and mentally, but we're now slowly getting through it.
Okay. And what is the implications, do you think? Do you think there's long-reaching implications, not just in South Africa, but say here in the States, because of something like this, which I don't think has ever happened before? Somebody, a person, a medical doctor, but also a researcher as yourself, basically testifying in court for hours upon hours. And this is all, again, people, if you're interested, right, this is all posted on YouTube. Your lectures, so to speak. So, and it's very good. But what is the implications, do you think, of this?
Well, what we realized, that we took the focus off me and my professional misconduct, because there was no professional misconduct, and we focused it on the dietary advice. And so we provided these 6,000 pages of scientific text, as against 12 pages they provided one study, which turned out to be fraudulent in the end. But anyway, so we presented all this information, and the judgment said that what we said was not unconventional and it was logical, but they didn't say that South Africa has to change the dietary guidelines to agree with what we said. Because you see, I was accused of giving unconventional advice, and then we got them to say, what is unconventional advice? So they said it's not evidence-based. So then we presented all the evidence that what I was saying is evidence-based. So technically, what the dietary guidelines at present, because they aren't evidence-based, are unconventional. So technically, any South African doctor or dietitian who prescribes a low-fat diet is prescribing an unconventional advice and could be reported to the Health Professional Council. So I think that we've opened the door for people to start questioning that. I don't think that the South African dietary guidelines are going to change tomorrow, but the point is the public can now judge, and they can see when we publish our book, they can see that there is no evidence for the current dietary guidelines, and whereas there's plenty of evidence that we should be eating the way that we propose. You're quite right. This is the first time in history that a medical doctor or a medical scientist has been charged or persecuted or prosecuted for his opinion. Galileo wasn't a medical doctor, but he was a scientist, and he was, of course, persecuted in the same way. But since then, we can't find any evidence that there's a medical scientist being prosecuted for expressing an opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really remarkable, and I would like to think it happened for a reason, right? And that all this is, it's becoming public, and because of the trial, hopefully a lot of people, not just general public, but also people in the medical field, will kind of wake up and realize, as you said, that the diet that has been prescribed since 1977 is not that evidence-based. So let's get to that. I mean, because it all kind of started in 1977 when the United States Department of Agriculture decided to change the way we eat and reduce fat, especially saturated fat, cholesterol from the diet. And they I mean, so they did this for an entire population. So it's almost like a huge experiment that's been going on for the last couple of decades. So, I mean, is there any evidence to? I mean, you have gone through all of this. You've looked at all of the research. And you have to go back in history, and I think a lot of people don't go back and they go look at stuff that's happened 30, 50, 60, even 100 years ago, even further back. So what is the diet that people used to eat, say even 50, 60 years ago, but maybe even let's go back further, 10,000 years ago, right, or for most of human history? What does that diet look like compared to now? And is there, again, any evidence for this low-fat diet that most people are that are on?
Yeah, I think if you go far enough back, humans became humans because we became carnivorous and we started eating particularly nutrient-dense protein and fat from animals. And that was the key development, because we've got this brain that needs a lot of energy. And the only way we could provide that energy was by killing other animals and eating them. And so that's the reality. And we were eating that way until we started extracting flour and sending flour around the world, and sugar followed that, and then vegetable oils followed that more recently. And the guy who really shows us is Weston Price, who in 1930 goes and travels across most of the continents. He finds the most isolated populations who are still eating their traditional foods. And he goes to see, can I find a population that's eating a plant-based diet? And he doesn't find one. So the idea that we can survive just by eating plants or grains is simply not true. It's never been sustained in any population. So most of the populations he finds that are very healthy are eating a high-fat diet. That's the key. The fat could come from animals, or it could come from seafood, or it could come from dairy, but all the healthy populations were eating a lot of fat. And then he worked out that it's the fat-soluble vitamins that you need, and also that you don't absorb minerals properly unless you have fat available. So the history is such that it's clear humans were attracted to eating fat, and our biology is that of fat-eating animals. Then all of a sudden, as you indicate, we did this massive global experiment in 1977, and we converted from this higher fat diet. It wasn't a very high fat diet that I and the rest of us were eating in the 60s, but it was only 35% carbohydrate or 40% carbohydrate, which is the upper limit of tolerance, clearly for me, that for humans. And we've pushed that number up to 65%. So that's what Americans are eating today, and all the other countries that follow those guidelines. We're eating up to 65% carbohydrate. And it's just not sustainable. We're not designed to do that. And that's what's caused the obesity diabetes epidemic. Now, you asked the question, was there any evidence? And there wasn't. And Nina Teichar presented her book, The Big Fat Surprise, but Zoe Harcom also came from Wales, and she's just completed her PhD earlier this year. And she asked the question, if she'd been alive in 1977 when the dietary guidelines came out, and she looked at all the evidence, where were the studies, particularly the randomized controlled trials? And she looked at all the evidence. There was absolutely no evidence that for benefit of change, if we were to change. And in fact, there was a lot of evidence that we shouldn't change. There was, for example, the famous Minnesota coronary experiment in which Ansel Keys put patients in mental hospitals in Minnesota on corn oil or versus eating their conventional food. So they were put on polyunsaturated fats. And the ones on the polyunsaturated fats did no better, or in fact did worse in some instances. So he just hid the data. If those data had been published in 1974, there would have been no change in the dietary guidelines. They could never have introduced them. But because Ansel Keys had hidden the data, and why did he hide them? Because his people said, because he was so convinced. Everyone who did the research was utterly convinced that they were right. And when the negative evidence came through, they couldn't believe it.
Yeah. What then about, so, I mean, you're saying basically there is very little evidence for people to eat a high carbohydrate diet. And I think most people, if you look at the medical scientific literature, you'll come to the same conclusion. But then people go, well, are all carbohydrates bad? What about fruits? What about vegetables? What about that the Chinese study? What about that very large scale study? Again, it was observational in nature. That's he said again. Don't eat animal products. You need to be eating plant based food. What do you say?
Well, that study's bogus, and it has been destroyed by Denise Minger. And if you go and check on the internet, you'll find her. She went through that book very carefully and showed firstly it's all associational studies, and secondly, the data don't even support the conclusion that the plant-based diet was better. There's no evidence in the book that that is the case when you actually look at the evidence. But unfortunately, Dr. Campbell, who wrote it, he was looking through a particular lens, and he's utterly convinced. And what I've learned is that vegans and vegetarians, it is a religion, and I'm very happy that they should have that religion, but they define their personality. This is what I am. I stand up for animal and care, and that's great. That's fantastic. And we support them 100%. Animals are not treated properly. However, you can't ignore the facts and then use that as evidence. It becomes activism, and activism is independent of science, and that's the problem. And I understand why they feel that they should be activists to protect animals. That's fine. But you have to look at the science. And if you don't look at the science, then you're acting an activist and you're not helping us. So there is no published evidence to show in randomized controlled trials that if you go on a fully plant-based diet, you'll be better. And for most of us, you see, the problem is we've become insulin resistant in the last 40 or 50 years, dramatically insulin resistant. And once you're insulin resistant, you can't eat more carbohydrates than a minimum amount, maybe 50, maybe 25, maybe 100 grams a day. But persisting in eating 200, 300, 400 grams, it doesn't matter if the carbohydrate is good or bad, so-called good or bad. The body doesn't know if this is a good carbohydrate or a bad carbohydrate. All it sees in the bloodstream coming from the intestine is carbohydrate, and it's a crisis. And it responds by secreting insulin, and that causes the problems. I think, what I realized is that, you see, we evolved or were created, whichever you choose, from hindgut fermenting primates. And a hindgut fermenter eats plant-based foods and converts them into saturated fats and absorbs it as saturated fat. So although you might think that they're eating carbohydrates, they're not. They're breaking the cellulose down into fat. And that fat then doesn't go to the liver. It goes via the lacteals. It goes to the rest of the body and it's stored in the fat cells. So the liver doesn't see this massive carbohydrate load. Then when we became carnivorous, the liver never saw a high carbohydrate load because now you were digesting meat in the small intestine and absorbing it as protein or amino acids, but there was no massive carbohydrate buildup. And I keep telling people that in our bloodstream we have only 5 grams of carbohydrate. That's 2 tiny packets of sugar. And now you're going to go and have your breakfast of cereals and bread and orange juice and high sugar yogurts, and you're just putting 200 or 300 grams of carbohydrate into the system that can only cope with 5 grams. And that's just breakfast. And so you hypersecrete insulin. And then at lunch you do the same. And of course at tea you do the same. And that's why we're sick. And it doesn't matter if you eat potatoes and rice and white rice or red, whatever. It's all carbohydrate. It's converted to glucose. And that's what the liver and the pancreas see. And they don't care whether it came from a good carbohydrate or a bad carbohydrate. All they see is glucose. And they respond in the way they respond. If we were designed to be carbohydrate-burning animals, we would have much more carbohydrate in the bloodstream. We wouldn't just have 5 grams. And people must understand you secrete insulin because if your glucose goes above that amount, you become unconscious. If it goes below that amount, you go unconscious. And that's what we're designed to keep glucose in that range. And you simply can't keep it in that range if you're eating high carbohydrate diets all the time.
Yeah. And I think the problem is, latest research shows that about 50% or just over 50% of the adult population are insulin resistant because they're either pre-diabetic or diabetic. And I think you might agree that if they use maybe other methods of testing, maybe looking at insulin, I mean, you have that Kraft 5-hour insulin assay, but maybe something like a 2-hour, or just looking at fasting insulin, that might be 5, 10, 15, I don't know, percent more than that. Um, and I'm teaching a class right now that's looking at prevention, treatment of chronic diseases, and this week we just spent all the time talking about insulin resistance. And with so many people, more people are insulin resistant than those who are not. I think that's why you're so passionate about this, saying, well, you got to eat a low carbohydrate diet, but the advice that they're getting is still to eat a high carbohydrate diet. I mean, would you consider that medical malpractice?
Well, absolutely. And it will be shown in future. In 50 years' time, when I'm long dead and buried, people will say, my gosh, how could we ever have fed humans this rubbish? And how could we not have understood the biology? The problem I've understood is that so few people understand the biology. They're just not interested in studying it anymore. My colleagues in medicine, they just want to prescribe a drug. This is your disease. You've got hypertension or you've got cancer or whatever. And no question of what's causing it. And we just give you a pill, and no understanding that these diseases didn't exist in populations eating properly. I mean, the Plains Indians in North America were the healthiest people in the world in the 1800s. And as the settlers moved west of the Mississippi and took away the bison, that was the end. And their health deteriorated. And then we spend so much money trying to explain why Plains Indians are unhealthy today and they're obese. Well, actually, you don't have to explain, because they were meat eaters, and now you put them on a high carbohydrate diet, and they're an insulin resistant population, and you've exposed them to these high carbohydrate foods, and they just can't tolerate it. And in my own country, exactly the same. We had a population who were mainly meat eaters, they were cattle eaters. Then we had a virus that came through here, the rinderpest. It wiped out the cattle, and that converted our black communities to eating grains and cereals and grains, and they became obese and diabetic, and we're the third most obese nation in the world. And is it difficult to explain? No. The answers are very simple. And so you're quite right. I know that 50% of Californians have been declared insulin resistant, but actually it's much higher. It's going to be 75%. When you start testing with insulin, it's going to be much higher than that.
Yeah. So do you think that everyone will benefit from some form of carbohydrate restriction?
What happens on this diet is that we're trying to get people off processed foods. I think that's the key. As soon as you move off processed foods, you get onto a higher fat, higher protein diet, which is nutrient dense. And that's the key. Weston Price, who was the first guy to show how healthy people were before they changed their diets, he made the point that the diet today is so nutrient poor and the only way you can get nutrient dense food again is to eat animal produce. So if you're going to eat only 3,000 calories a day because that's all the energy we're doing, if you're eating processed food, you're just not going to get the nutrients you need. You're not going to get the vitamins, particularly the fat soluble vitamins. You're not going to get the minerals that you require. And you're not told that. And we're not told that the way we grow our grains today, the soil is completely depleted of minerals. So the grains we're eating are much worse than they were 100 years ago. And I think that also helps explain why there were grain-eating populations that were pretty healthy 100 years ago. But they weren't just eating grains. They still had a high-fat, high-meat diet, but they ate grains as well. But we've destroyed all that because the grains we're eating are bad. They're they're poor in nutrients, but we're not eating any of the other good stuff to balance it up.
Yeah. So what about people, like I have a couple of colleagues who are pretty lean, and I go, well, this low carb stuff, that's nonsense. Look at me, I eat high carbohydrate diet, for most of my life, and look at me, I'm skinny, I'm doing good.
Well, okay, maybe 5% of them are true. They are healthy, but you got to check. And I remember a young doctor came to see me, 33 years old, and he healthy, running marathons. He had a fasting glucose of 7.5 millimoles, which would be about 130, 140, or way over the normal. And he said, I couldn't believe that I'm diabetic and I'm 33 and I'm lean. And I said, yeah, it's difficult because many insulin-resistant people, 40% of thin people are insulin-resistant. So it's not the fact that you're lean just tells you that your fat cells aren't storing fat. That's what it tells you. It doesn't tell you that you're not insulin-resistant.
Yeah, yeah. Also, would you agree that people, another big problem, if not a bigger problem, is the fact that people are not just eating a high carbohydrate diet, but also a high fat diet. They end up with this high carb, high fat diet. And I'm doing a study right now that's looking at habitual macronutrient intake in overweight and obese individuals. And the study is not done yet. It'll probably take another year or so. But just when I look at the data, just kind of the preliminary data, I mean, carbohydrate intake right now is just over 40%. So it's still from a percentage perspective, it's still making out the majority. From a gram perspective, it's maybe like it's over 200 grams, maybe close to 250 grams. Some people are like 400, 500 grams. And then fat is very close to 40%. So they're very close to one another. And again, sugar intake right now, just the average person in our study is consuming somewhere between 20 and 30 teaspoons of sugar a day. Some people 40, 50 teaspoons. And so what is the dangers of that? Not just a high carb diet, but when the two are close together.
Well, some people would say that the sugar, that's the worst component. And I mean, the numbers you are frightening because that's going to give you the fatty liver, which makes you even more insulin resistant and then causes you to get the atherogenic dyslipidemia, all the abnormal cholesterols in the bloodstream and the lipoproteins and so on. But you're quite right because all the fat that you have in your fat cells actually originates from fat in your diet. That's an important point to make. Maybe not all of it, but the majority of fat in your fat cells comes from dietary fat. Now, if you're combining a high fat and a high carbohydrate diet, what you'll do is burn the carbohydrates because that's the crisis. You've got to keep your glucose low. So you're going to burn all the carbohydrate by secreting insulin. And that insulin is going to put the fat in your fat cells and it locks it in there. And most people eating high fat, high carbohydrate diets are metabolically crippled because they're just burning carbohydrates. The carbohydrate they eat, they just burn because they have to get rid of it. It's so toxic. And so they're always in this state of carbohydrate oxidation and they never get to burn the fat. And the only way you can burn the fat, obviously, is to get your insulin down. And the only way you can get insulin down is to drop your carbs below 50 grams a day. So you're describing the real problem that you've got a high sugar intake, which is giving you fat in the liver, which is making you more insulin resistant, which makes you to secrete more insulin when you take in the carbohydrates. And that's going to just drive the fat into the fat cells even more and keep it locked away. So that's a perfect storm if you want to kill yourself. High sugar, high carbs, high fat diet.
Yeah. And so the best recommendation, in your opinion, for those individuals, or it would seem like for the majority of the population, especially here in the United States. I mean, I went to the hospital yesterday. I had a ear problem. But when I was there, it's quite sad because so many people were walking through, are not just obese, but they are morbidly obese.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that they get, again, they're put on medications. They're numerous medications, and they're not really told the correct dietary advice. So would you say, again, for the majority of the population, based upon the evidence, whether it's from a weight loss perspective, a cardiovascular perspective, a metabolic perspective, that carbohydrate restriction would clearly be the best option?
Yeah, how many people are healthy in the population today? Certainly in South Africa, in Cape Town, where I live, it's pretty few. And I do exactly what you do. I just go and look and see. And the size of the people worries me because as soon as you get big, you're insulin resistant and you're eating the wrong food. And the only way you're going to sort your problem out is cut the sugar and cut the processed foods and eat more fat in the diet. And the disconnect is unbelievable. That's, for example, in Cape Town, we're the diabetes capital of Southern Africa, but no one takes it seriously. No one is telling people except ourselves. You've got to change the diet. And it's so sad because people live a life which is second-rate, third-rate lives. And that's frustrating to see that they are so incapacitated by carrying all this weight around, and they can't do it. And they must have a terrible life. And there is a solution. The best weight loss guy I've met has lost 260 pounds, more than 260 pounds. That just to give you an idea, 130 kilograms, it's more like 300 pounds. And his life is completely changed. He was essentially bedridden, and now he's training for an Ironman triathlon. One of the guys I met last night, I just came back from Johannesburg, and at the airport, he met me, and he lost 82 kilograms, which is, again, close to 200 pounds. And he's looking unbelievable. He said, "Doc, I'm just pumping the iron now." And he's just a ball of muscle. And he was a ball of fat. I mean, at his weight of 300 pounds, he was just a round ball of fat. And now he's a muscular human being. And he just says, "You saved my life." And that's it. I didn't save his life. It's the diet that saved his life.
So it's I mean, for most people, again, they would really benefit from restricting their carbohydrates less than, say, 50 grams per day. But obviously I think once you've done that, you can see what carbohydrate intake for you, is best. Maybe for me it's 100 grams, maybe for another person it's 50 grams, maybe for another person it's 25 grams. But at the same time, you don't just have to, if you go down with the one, something else has to go up.
Yeah.
And that something else would be
fat. Yeah. Because protein, by and large, people continue to eat pretty much the same amount of protein. You can't eat too much protein or you get sick. And so...
What do you recommend for protein?
I think the 1.5 grams per kilogram, round about there, maybe a bit more. I don't think you want to cut your protein, particularly at my age. You want to make sure you've got a decent protein intake. For many people, protein is satiating so let's make the point that the diet that works for you is the one that takes away your hunger. That's the key. People are obese because they're hungry. And they're hungry because they're eating too much carbohydrate, which then stimulates the brain and you overeat because it's highly addictive, sugar and carbohydrate. So you need to find the foods that satiate you. And for many of us, it's fat. But for some women, it's not. Fat actually makes them eat more. And so they become hungry and they want to eat more on fat. So you have to find what foods make you satiate you, and then focus on them. But in general, we must increase the fat intake because that's those fat-soluble vitamins that really make us healthy. And that you can't get away from that. You've got to have fat in the diet to make yourself healthy.
Say fat, what does that look like? Because when people say fat, they think maybe, again, I talk to people about this, even people, really smart people, when they say fat, they go like, well, chips and Twinkies and...
But, you make a very good point, because where do you think most of the fat in the diet comes from on the 1977 US dietary guidelines? It comes from exactly what you said, chips and biscuits and cakes. They're all made with fat, and people don't understand it, that they've got shortening in them or whatever it's called, and they can't do without it. So that's where a huge amount of fat comes in. So when you eat a cookie, you're eating a muffin, there's plenty of fat in there. So cutting the muffin, but that's usually the bad fat because it's a polyunsaturated hydrogenated fats, which you don't want. You want to eat the fats that occur naturally in the environment, and preferably the fat from grass-fed animals. That's the milk and the cheese and the meat and the fat from grass-fed animals. That's critical. So, and then the other ones, coconuts and avocados and macadamia nuts, those are also other great sources of fat. And I mentioned eggs probably as well. So those are the sources of fat. So they're all natural products, but don't eat margarine and polyunsaturated vegetable oils. Those are just highly toxic. And of course, what are we told to eat? American Heart Association came out this week and said we've got to cut the saturated fat and replace it with polyunsaturated fats. What they didn't tell you is that they get $5 for every bag of soy that is sold. They get $5. So of course they're going to promote polyunsaturated soy oil and all that nonsense. But they are so conflicted because the evidence is absolutely clear. If you eat vegetable oils, you're going to hurt your health.
Yeah. Yeah, no, even for saturated fat, when you look at the evidence, again, whether it's causing stroke or cardiovascular disease, again, there's there's even very little evidence to support that as well. But just lastly here, so we can move on to some other quick topics, is what would your advice be for a young exercise science student, or just I have some students who are interested in physician assistant school or going to med school. What would your advice be for them going forward? Because again, I have other people or colleagues who said it you can't talk a lot about these things because it's dangerous.
Mm.
It's dangerous to say, well, I think most people, because they're insulin resistant, need to be eating a low carbohydrate diet. Like, oh, you can't say that.
No, no. Well, look what happened to me. I mean, that's a classic example. And and I'm not the only one. There's Gary Fetke in Tasmania in Australia who's also had a case against him. There's a couple of other dietitians in New Zealand and Australia who've lost their practices because they promoted high-fat diets for diabetics. And we know now there's data coming out all the time showing that that's the diet that helps in diabetes. And by the end of the year, we will have definitive evidence showing that if you're a diabetic, you better be on a high-fat diet if you want to be healthy. So my opinion is the problem in medicine has been captured by the pharmaceutical industry completely and utterly. And so we've got this pharmacological model of disease, which begins in America in the 1911s with the Flexner report. But that's I'm just throwing that out for people to go and read up about the Flexner report and how Rockefeller influenced the fact that medicine is purely pharmacologically based. Rockefeller decided in the 1900s that this would be the case. And the Flexner report explains how he achieved that. And that is why we are so biased towards believing we must take a pharmaceutical drug to get healthy. The problem with medicine is it's captured by the pharmaceutical industry, and the pharmaceutical industry's job is to sell product. And they're going to sell that product however they want to. And I suspect they're tied up with the food industry because the food industry makes you sick, and then the pharmaceutical industry comes along and pretends to help you. So I wouldn't be very positive about telling people to study medicine. By and large, it's a great training, but it's not a great profession. It's because once you've done the training, you find that actually I can't help the patients using the way I've been taught. It doesn't help. You can't reverse chronic disease caused by nutrition with pills. And so I always advise people that I think the big problem in medicine is that the doctors are no longer taught physiology and biochemistry properly. They don't understand it. They're not interested. Just give me a pill that I can prescribe. And don't ask me to find a cause. But if you talk to chemical pathologists who are doctors trained in chemical pathology, they'll all tell you, of course we're right to promote a high-fat diet. The biology is simple. But unfortunately, my colleagues don't understand that because they've been captured, as I've indicated. They've been controlled by cardiology and that you're going to die of heart disease when you're not. You're going to die of diabetes. And the low-fat diet has caused the diabetes epidemic, and no one acknowledges that. And it's diabetes that causes the worst forms of heart disease and stroke and peripheral vascular disease. So my colleagues and I are responsible with the dietitians for causing the diabetes epidemic. And sooner or later, we're going to have to front up and say, apologize, we were the cause. So if I was to advise your students, I would say probably don't think about medicine unless you've got an exit strategy and you really want to become proactive in this way and teach other ways of treating chronic disease and using nutrition as the primary basis. But don't go through conventional training and follow the conventional way of being a doctor. That's not going to be very helpful in the long term. And again, I don't think the medical profession is going to last very much longer in the way it is at the moment because the public is becoming too clever and they're realizing it doesn't work. We have to use a different model.
Just about like exercise science students, because a lot of times they hear one thing from me, kind of this what we're talking about right now. But in exercise science here in the United States, you get stuff coming from the ACSM or say NSCA, so kind of the big governing bodies in exercise science, and they hear another thing and they're going, well, these organizations, especially ACSM, they must know what they're talking about. And why are you disagreeing or saying basically saying something that's completely opposite? So what do you know, how do you handle that situation, or from a student perspective?
Well, you first have to ask where's the conflicts of interest. And the American College of Sports Medicine is directed by Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola. And through the Gatorade Foundation and the Gatorade Sports Science Institute and the Exercise is Medicine program, which is funded by Coca-Cola. Now, why would Coca-Cola be wanting to make people healthy by getting them to exercise? What's that got to do with Coca-Cola? And the answer is it's got nothing to do with Coca-Cola, except it confuses the public, because the public now believes in the counting calories model. So you see, if you can have your Coca-Cola as long as you exercise the calories, then you're fine. And all calories are equal, doesn't matter where they came from. And of course, that's nonsensical. And so that's why the problem for the American College of Sports Medicine is they will be exposed in due course, that they have also sold out to Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola is spreading the model that as long as you exercise, you can outrun a bad diet, and you can't. The Coca-Cola that you have today makes you fat because it stimulates your appetite and you eat more calories tomorrow. And because it's highly addictive, the sugar and the corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, addicts you so you overeat the next day. And you can go and run all you like, but if your diet's wrong, you're just going to get fat and lazy and sick. So that's the issue. So now, and the American College of Sportsmen has another problem. It's trying to control the dietary advice people get, because it doesn't want you to follow this diet, the high-fat diet, because that conflicts with what Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola are paying them to say. So the ACSM wants all nutrition to be controlled by the same forces that are controlling them. And that's the tragedy. So the ACSM unfortunately lost all its credibility when it sold out to Gatorade in about 1987, 88. That began the downfall of the independence of the American College of Sports Medicine.
Okay. All right. So let's switch topics, but not completely. Let's go to sports nutrition a little bit. And a couple of months ago at the Exercise Science Symposium we had here, I did a talk that just looked at, are carbohydrates still king? And when you go back and again you look at the literature, or just most people know this, again, if you're an athlete, whether you're a professional athlete, collegiate athlete, or recreational athlete, or go to a ACSM national or regional conference, there's normally some nutrition talk that you get, and it's all the same in terms of make sure you eat quite frequently throughout the day, and make sure that the macronutrient composition of the meals and the snacks are high in carbohydrate. Because if it's not high in carbohydrate, you're going to get tired, you're going to get fatigued, and your performance is going to deteriorate. So we've lived in this high carbohydrate, or we've had this high carbohydrate mentality in sports nutrition also for a long period of time. So, and you yourself used to be a high carbohydrate proponent for athletes in the book, Law of Running, but I know you ripped that out. You're busy writing a new version of that. But what do you think is the role of carbohydrates in sports nutrition?
Great question. So I think you have to divide sports nutrition into the elite athletes who are really struggling to achieve that 1% difference or 0.1% difference, and the 99.9% of people who are not elite athletes. And if we take the non-elite athletes, they will always do better on a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet because their long-term health will benefit, rather than eating all this high-carbohydrate diet, which is going to increase their risk of type 2 diabetes. So a marathon runner who's running 5 hours is going to benefit by eating a high-fat diet, because that person is going to lose weight and will not have to carry all the same amount of weight. And anyway, they're always burning fat, and they want to burn the fat in the marathon. So if you're going to go beyond 3 hours, even if you're an elite athlete, I think 3 hours is probably the break point, and you want to be taking in fat and want to be fat adapted beyond 3 hours. But for everyone else, if you're a jogger, recreational athlete, you should never go into this high carbohydrate diet, because it's pointless. You're just asking your pancreas to secrete too much insulin. You're causing too much insulin secretion, and you're going to damage your health in the long term. The only athletes who maybe perhaps can be encouraged to eat a little bit more carbohydrate, and by that I mean up to 200 grams a day. I don't see why you ever need to eat more than 200 grams per day, is athletes involved in more explosive activities. And where they have to, particularly where they have to up and down the intensity of the effort, like in the Tour de France cyclists. People who have to speed up and slow down, maybe running a mile or whatever, it seems that they do need a bit more carbohydrate. But again, I'm not convinced that they need a huge amount of carbohydrate. So I think that 99% of so-called athletes will do much better by just being told, eat a high-fat diet because it's going to make you healthier in the long term. For the elite athletes, there's a small group who probably benefit by eating a high-carbohydrate diet.
But even for those athletes, again, even collegiate athletes, right? Because college sports in the United States are very big. Um, Even for those athletes who are participating in those high intensity, short duration activities, or maybe intermittent high intensity type of activities, where you're saying, more of a high carbohydrate diet kind of is the rocket fuel that they might need. But are you referring to during the event? What about training? Should the rest of the time maybe they would be restricting carbohydrate, and then before the event or during the event high carbohydrate? What is your take on that?
Yeah, because, I just believe that you've only got so much carbohydrate you can eat in your life. And then eventually the whole system's going to pack down. So rather eat the least amount that you want to get by on, the least amount of carbohydrate you can get by on. That's kind of the message. And rather than the old model, which I promoted, which was to stuff yourself with carbohydrate, you should actually restrict to eat as little as you need to get by. And people will be amazed at how little they need to do their activities. For example, if you're training every day and you're doing some explosive sport, but not too much, your body will resynthesize the glycogen overnight in the muscles because you're still producing glucose in the liver, even if you're eating a high-fat diet. And that glucose has got to go somewhere, and it goes into the muscles. So it's not as if you don't have any glycogen, you do. So you take a lineman in American football who weighs 300 pounds, and is obese or morbidly obese. Feeding them carbohydrates is just making them worse. You're just killing them. They're going to become diabetic. They need to muscle up. I mean, I'm not teaching anyone in America how to play football, but for their health, in terms of their health, they'd be much better to have more muscle and a bit less fat. But they're not going to get it on this high carbohydrate diets. So I understand they're fattening themselves up like cattle or pigs by eating a high carbohydrate diet. But it's harming their health, and it's not making them more powerful or stronger. It's making them heavier, that's true. But that doesn't mean to say they'll be heavier, they'll be going to be stronger at that weight.
Okay. Yeah, so what about, have you seen good evidence in terms of low carbohydrate, high fat diets and recovery? Because we spend so much time looking at actual performance, but what about recovery?
Well, all the elite athletes that I've had dealings with, and I'm talking about international class to world class, when they adapt the diet, they say I recover more quickly and I don't feel as inflamed as I did in the past. And my knees are better and I've got the pain that I had before. I mean, that's almost universal observation. And their mood changes as well. They become much more calm and relaxed. So you're quite right. You see, all the studies we do in exercise science is we put people on these diets and then we put them in the laboratory for a 2-hour time trial. And we say, if they go do better in the time trial, that's better. But we don't worry about, did they train? Could they train better? Could they recover more quickly? Did they have fewer injuries? And I believe that the high-fat diet will affect all of those variables, and we have to measure them. And we don't. So we've spoken mainly about the health benefits, but I just wonder if you take a year, athletes, they don't train for one day. They train every day for years, and they have a performance over 3 or 4 years that they're looking to improve. How do we know that eating this diet over years isn't produce a long-term benefit?
Yeah. So what about, because I also have students who are saying, well, who's more interested in resistance training, gaining muscle fiber hypertrophy. Will a low carbohydrate diet be beneficial for gaining muscle?
Well, I mean, I'd ask them, so how can you build protein from carbohydrate? You see, that that would be the immediate question. And the answer is no, you build it from protein. So rather, if you believe that you build muscles from diet, the diet impacts on your muscle, which I'm not convinced, by the way. As long as you've got enough protein in the diet, you probably will hypertrophy as much as you will, or as much as you can, because we have this genetic limitation. So it doesn't make sense to eat carbohydrate. Carbohydrate might help to allow you to do a bit more explosive exercise, but again, for most people eating a high-fat diet, they're going to build up enough glycogen in their muscles overnight that they can do the activity the next day. So anyway, but you shouldn't be doing high-intensity exercise every day. So you should be resting a few days, build up the glycogen, and then do some more heavy repetitions. So my argument would be that you're going to do better on this diet anyway, even though you're going to start with perhaps a little bit less glycogen in your muscles.
Yeah. Also, what about this idea? Because in exercise physiology, we commonly teach that fat burns in a carbohydrate flame, right? And that goes to this whole idea where all the different substrates gets oxidized within the Krebs cycle, and so once your carbohydrates gets depleted, doesn't matter how much fat you have, even though you might have, say, 70,000 kilocalories coming from fat in the body, it's not going to get oxidized because they have to get into the Krebs cycle, and then that's going to be it for you. You're going to hit the wall, fatigue, there goes performance, and so we teach that. Then the recommendation is, well, that's why you have to make sure you get the carbohydrates in the whole time. And so what's the problem with that?
Well, that's a great theory that kind of doesn't fit to the facts. The facts are the following: that if you take a fat-adapted athlete and start them exercising, they can burn up to 1.5 grams per minute, whereas a carbohydrate-adapted athlete can only burn 0.5 grams per minute. So there's a threefold difference. Now, hold it, but this athlete's high-fat diet, they can't burn fat because it's burning in the flame of carbohydrates. But hold it, they're burning 3 times as much fat. The person who's got so much fat carbohydrates on board can't burn the fat, and they can't because of insulin. So it's a nonsensical argument. And what we know in our own experiments is that the fat oxidizers continue at 1.5 grams just for the whole duration of the activity. What happens with the other people, they start at 0.5, they get up to 0.7, and that's it. They can't get any higher. But they've got all carbohydrates, but they can't burn it because they don't have the mitochondria the mitochondria aren't tooled up to burn the fat. So, I don't know the biochemistry, but the truth is that you still do have carbohydrates in the body if you're fat adapted, because you are generated through gluconeogenesis. You're generating carbohydrates and you are secreting carbohydrates. So, and it works because you can still oxidize all this fat. So the clear evidence is that the theory doesn't fit what we find in practice.
Okay. Now, I feel like when you look at the research, when you look at the literature, there is an enormous body of literature that stretches a mile long in every direction from a low carbohydrate diet and from a health perspective. From a sports nutrition perspective, I feel like there's definitely less evidence. So what would your advice be for individuals, who want to do more research on low carbohydrate diets, and look at the efficacy of those? What would your advice be?
Well, I'm just looking at my law of running, which is appearing over your left ear at the moment. And that book has got so much evidence about carbohydrates being beneficial for you. And of course, that's true because they've funded studies by Gatorade and other people on carbohydrate adapted athletes. And it's very easy to prove carbohydrates work if you're carbohydrate adapted. It's a little more difficult to prove that a high fat diet works because firstly, there's just so little money available, and that's why there's no research being done, or very little research being done. But it's definitely the way of the future. I can tell you that more and more world-class athletes by the day are realizing that the high-fat diet's the way to go for many of the reasons you explained, because they feel healthier. And if they're insulin resistant, they're always going to do better on a high-fat diet than on a high-carbohydrate diet. So it's happening all the time. And And it's remorseless. And as I've said, 3 hours, if you're exercising more than 3 hours, the evidence is, to me, it's abundantly clear from the biology and the anecdotes that we have, that those people are shifting very quickly to high-fat diets. It's only in the shorter distances that there's more resistance. But I convert people every day, and I was chatting to one of South Africa's best athletes in ultra distance events, and she said yesterday, she said, I've had enough, I'm changing. And she said, but I will always take my carbs during the races, and that is true. And I said to her, because it acts in your brain. The carbohydrates that you ingest when you're running a 3, 4, 5-hour event, they actually act as a drug. And so it'll always look like they're helping you. And they do help you, but it's acting as a drug. Metabolically, you want your muscles to burn fat. Your brain you can stimulate with a drug if you want to and give it a bit of carbohydrates. And that's the way we're going, I think, that we're going to find the minimum amount of carbohydrate people need to train every day on, and then they'll need to take a little bit more carbohydrate when they're racing and indeed take during races. So one of the other guys I helped finish fourth in our local Ironman, beat his best time. He did 8-hour Ironman, ran a 2:57 marathon at the end, and he said he's been on the diet for 16 weeks, and he just said it's amazing how much. But he took 50 grams of carbohydrate every hour for 8 hours. So he took in, but it was only 400 grams. So, over months, he's only taking in 400 grams during a race of 8 hours. And that's not going to affect your health in any way. So that's fine. But eating 400 grams a day was a problem for him.
Just quickly looking at fatigue, because again, that's a huge area in research, and people always want to know what causes fatigue. Why do we get tired? Right? Because if we can figure out why do I get tired, obviously I can implement some type of nutritional or training strategy to delay the onset of development of fatigue. But depending on who you talk to, they're going to give you another idea about what causes fatigue. And so to some people it's cardiovascular, or some people it's metabolic, or some people it's neurological. And you've done a lot of work on this, and you guys came up with the central governor model of fatigue. And can you just get into that just briefly? And again, because you explain that fatigue is merely another emotion, and that's hard to kind of grasp. So that's a very different way to look at it. And what is the implication of that from a training and performance perspective?
So if you read Law of Running, it'll tell you that glycogen in the muscles determines exercise performance, and all fatigue develops because you run out of glycogen. And so that's why I've got to redo the whole book and show that your brain determines performance. And so the whole focus of the book changes. But, you don't realize that for 30 years we were trying to reduce exercise performance to one variable: nutrition, glycogen in the muscles. And I mean, it's complete rubbish. I mean, how could we ever have thought that? So, so I apologize. But so what is clear to us is that the brain is there to make sure you don't die during exercise. And of course, some people do die, but those are acute events. Mostly the brain is very clever, and it anticipates the outcome. And it uses fatigue to make sure you don't overstress yourself during exercise. And so your fatigue ramps up, your sensation of fatigue ramps up as a function of the distance you've gone and how close you are to the finish. And that's what is used to regulate your exercise performance. So the central governor model really just says that the brain acts in anticipation to make sure you get to the finish intact without destroying your body. And there's clear evidence that is the case. So if we modify something, we make it hotter, or we give you less oxygen, you slow down. You don't rush off to the finish and drop dead. You slow down right from the word go. And so it's very clear that that's how the brain is working. And so what we try to tell people is that you work within a normal physical, you've got a physical range of performance. And you go up and down based on physiological and psychological factors. But that's the range. And the top limit is set by your brain telling you you're not going to kill yourself. So you work within that range, and then there's everything in your body influences that where you sit on that performance range. So of course nutrition, sleep involved, motivation, critical, self-belief, all these things. Did you take glucose, the drug acting? Were you properly hydrated? They all act, but they can never take you outside that safety zone. So you're always sitting in there. And I think that's helpful for people to understand two things. Firstly, that everything impacts on your performance, everything. So whereas law of running, you read, oh, well, as long as I go and eat my carbs, I'm going to win the race. Nonsense. Did you sleep the night before? Did you have an argument, etc.? What are you thinking about? So you've got to factor all those things in. Everything is important. And secondly, the sensation of fatigue is merely a sensation, and you can ignore it if you possibly can, and just say, listen, I don't have to listen to you. We're doing some really fabulous stuff at the moment, and we're coming out with a new article. It's a couple of new articles on the central governor. And they're really exciting because they show that affect is terribly important. So you fit in here during your performance, but it's how you feel about the performance is very important, and what your emotion is. They modulate your performance. And as soon as you start feeling that you're losing the race or whatever, you're not going to win it, your affect changes, and then your whole biology changes again, and you start to get what we call an action crisis. So if you read Law of Running, it'll tell you, gosh, you at 20 miles in the race, you feel terrible in the marathon because you run out of glycogen. It's nonsense. You're getting an action crisis. And the action crisis saying, is it worth me continuing because I'm feeling so bad, and actually it doesn't matter that I break a 3-hour marathon today. Maybe 3 hours, 10 minutes isn't so bad. And that's the action crisis. And your biology changes as you go through that action crisis. So what we try to say is, listen, you work within your biology, and your behavior can change, but it'll never get you outside that range. But the sensation you're feeling, it's just your body just trying to fool you. So you don't have to listen to it. Just keep going, and don't start negative thoughts, and keep your affect high, and keep laughing and smiling and enjoying it. And the other thing we found, by the way, is that the best athletes have the best affect. They feel the best. So the whole idea that the elite runners win because they can sustain fatigue and sustain all the negative symptoms. They don't have the negative symptoms to the same degree that the rest of us have, because they feel fantastic. So that's the point. The better you feel in the race, the better you're going to do. So try to generate those feelings of positive affect, feeling good, and not worrying about the outcome, etc.
Do you think it's the same for even shorter distances?
Yeah, and I think that
shorter, again, intermittent or high intensity.
Now, then the biology is completely dominant, because then you could kill yourself. So, for example, 800-meter run. Yeah, you can start off fast, but eventually the feedback becomes so powerful that it's going to slow you down, and you can't override that. That's a very good point. The longer the event, the more chance you have early on to override the system, because the feedback isn't yet strong enough to restrict you. So you can easily go too fast early on. But once you're in that zone of pain and discomfort, you just can say, listen, I understand what you're trying to do, but I'm not going to listen to you. Just an emotion.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about fatigue. But I want to last question, and then I'll let you go. And it's about, I mean, if we go back to kind of your introduction, I mean, your whole career has been about challenging traditionally held beliefs, and you're doing it to this very day. I mean, why do you like doing this? So over your whole career, you've done this. Why you like doing this? And you think it's important, again, for current professionals in this field to adopt that same paradigm?
Thanks very much for making that point. I think my problem was that I discovered all these paradoxes, and a paradox is something that doesn't make sense on the basis of what we currently know. And I tell my students, and I would tell your students as well, I'd plead for them, please study paradoxes. So when the textbook says this should happen and it doesn't, that's when I get really interested and go and look at it. And so I've answered 7 challenges. You're quite correct. And fortunately, I was correct on the 6th and proven, and then finally on the 7th, I'm also correct. And even if I haven't been fully proven, I'm right on this about nutrition. But I had this personality that if you give me a paradox, that to me tells me that whatever is being taught is wrong. And I don't want to continue teaching that error. And then I go and look at it, and if I do see the evidence doesn't fit what we're currently explaining in the way we're explaining it, I said, I've got to dig into this. And I'm obsessive compulsive about the information. I just go and look for it, and I read and buy books and internet searches and so on until I get the answers that I want, and then I present them. So it's very important, because education today is not what it was. Education is to become part of the herd and not to ask questions. And as you've indicated, people don't want to go this way because they're going to alienate themselves from the rest of the people. And people want to be in the herd, but in education, that's why we go to universities. If we knew everything, we wouldn't have universities. And that's what I try to tell students. You're here to learn to think differently and to ask the tough questions and to stand up for knowledge. And if it's not true, don't procreate those ideas. The lecture I gave to my students today was, how did the central governor come about? And again, I remained fascinated that Hill developed the model in 1923 on the basis of work done on frogs, amphibian muscled frog, in 1907. And this lasts right through till we attack it in the 1990s, late 1990s. So this idea holds forth for 90 years and people don't question it. How is it possible that we've graduated hundreds of thousands of exercise physiologists between 1907 and 1997 and no one questions? Actually, you can't build a model on the experiments that they did in the 1920s and then think the model's true. So that's it, Ask questions, go and see what the truth is, and don't accept anything. That's what our thing is. Just don't accept anything as being true, including what I've just said all today.
Well, Dr. Noakes, we just want to thank you. We really appreciate your time, and just want to thank you for doing this. So thank you.
My pleasure, Philip, and best regards to you and to your students, and good luck to them in the future. And as I've said, ask the tough questions. Thanks so much.